Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, as Trump has to once again kick the can down the road regarding tariffs on Beijing, China's economy and exports hit new all-time highs.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, Beijing's making, an utter mockery of the United States' intended policy decisions. And of course, it's worth recalling the US thought they could tariff China into oblivion, and China responded in kind, and the United States panicked and immediately retraced all idea of putting 140 odd percent tariffs on Chinese imports, and then went for a 90-day pause, which keeps being kicked further and further down the road. And in the process, China continues to decouple enormously from the US. And why shouldn't it? Because where is the trust? I mean, accused at times Russia being a bit naive with regards to the US, with respect to, for example, Ukraine and the Minsk agreements in the past. Well, China's far less trusting and has obviously retaliated as well with its policy decisions with respect to rare earths, which is causing mayhem in the US defense sector, as we know, and also starting to obviously impact, uh, commercial sectors as well, because there's this grey area, which I think China's actually just doing it to be bloody minded by going, well, this could be also dual use, so when you're not having it either. But for as long as I can remember, there has been people making statements all over social media, whether it was X as it is now, or Twitter as it was in the past, or other platforms going on about the never-ending demise of China, how China's economy is falling apart, how the yuan's collapsing, how China's commercial real estate's collapsing. And it's worth just noting some recent data that's come out, which makes an utter mockery of these statements, but also something that should significantly concern the United States, because what China's clearly doing, and they're not hiding the fact, is not only are they uh, fighting like for like with the US over tariffs, but they're also carrying on, as we said, or I said at the start, with regards to decoupling. And I'll give way to you, Ken, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of what this data is showing us.
Yeah, when we were looking into and doing some study and research leading into this podcast, obviously the thing that stuck out was no matter what has happened about the U.S. trying to disconnect itself from China or even trying to uh, create schisms between China and its trade partners, Chinese exports reached a new all-time high. And there was something interesting, and this might be something we want to go into on a different podcast sometime down the road. But Besant was on with Kudlow, and he pretty much let the cat out of the bag of just how desperate the U.S. is in regards to its industry and manufacturing, making reference to our allies, U.S. allies' wealth is seen as an American sovereign wealth fund, with his words, directing them largely at the president's discretion to use the money in order to build American factories and reshore American industries. The important thing I think out of this is that the U.S. is relying upon everybody else to suddenly reindustrialize and to be the exports to the world. And China, meanwhile, is sitting there going, "We're offering you cheaper goods, and we already have the infrastructure and the means to do it." And the world, of course, is responding in kind by going to China and going away from the US. And I think we're seeing that also in the CPI and the inflation numbers that came out just yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth making the point with regards to what Bess had said. That's just an admission. The United States is broke. It's on its knees. It's bankrupt. if it's having to effectively almost treat its allies like colonies and saying, well, you know, you're going to give us everything we want because we've got nothing we can invest ourselves. And it'll be predicated, and these are my words, on the US going, well, we provide you with security. You know, we're defending you from Russia, who's your arch enemy. In the meantime, we'll see what happens on Friday, but the US is trying to actually have rapprochement with this big bad arch enemy and saying, well, we can trade with you, and there's a lot of projects we can work on in, for example, the Arctic region, etc. So the US needs to make up its mind: is Russia the arch enemy or not? And Europe should have the sense to go, well, hang on, if they are, why do you want to have that level of rapprochement with them? But coming back to the issue of Chinese trade, it's worth noting if you look at China's trade surplus on a sort of 12-month cumulative basis, then it reached a record high of $1.2 trillion equivalent in the last 12 months. And if you go back, this trade balance has actually more than doubled over the last 5 years. In fact, it's actually trebled. So, and this also tellingly comes at a time when Chinese export, when everyone was saying China's economy's in serious trouble. I mean, there was all these statements that China's got huge deflation, its producer price inflation is collapsing, it's not going to be able to manufacture these goods anymore. Well, weirdly, China's actually exporting more to the rest of the world, excluding the United States. And this is all part of this ongoing decoupling, which we've talked about previously. And if you look at the 12-month exports to the world and exclude the United States, they've actually increased by 400 billion to a record 3.2 trillion over the last 18 months. And just to add more sort of credence to what we're saying, China's cumulative 12-month manufacturing surplus, also when priced in dollar terms, hit a record high of $2 trillion. So what this is telling us is China's expanding its global trade despite US tariffs. In fact, US tariffs are actually enormously benefiting China because the world's going, well, we could trade with the United States, but we've got no idea whether it's 10% tariffs today and 20% tomorrow and 50% the week after, and maybe 20% the week after that. We've got no idea what's going on, but we can have reliable trade relations with the Chinese, who are signing agreements all over the world in terms of free trade, not least upgrading that with the ASEAN countries, which is obviously in Southeast Asia, as one example of this. So who do you want to trade with? A country that can actually produce these goods that you require at very affordable prices, or you're going to trade with the United States, who freely admits it's bankrupt and hasn't got any money to build any of the factories, hasn't got the skills to manufacture these goods, hasn't got the infrastructure which allows the United States to ship goods produced somewhere in the vast 4 million square miles the United States is, because it doesn't have roads and railways and bridges and ports that are capable of handling that throughput. And of course, even if they had all that, there's the small matter of the fact that China can produce a widget for a fraction of the cost. So who is going to buy the widget from the United States? No one. And everyone will then, well, not everyone, a lot of Trump supporters come out and go, well, they don't want to export. This is for the internal market, for internal consumption. But what that therefore implies is in the United States, they're going to have a choice. They're going to either import the widget for a fraction of the price or buy the widget for 4, 5, whatever times the cost in the US. Well, they're still going to want to buy the imports from China, for example, not exclusively, even if they have 100% tariffs or 200%. But the problem is, if you put 200% tariffs, and the US has this habit of blanket tariffing everything, then you're going to put 200% on goods that the United States just cannot and will never be able to manufacture themselves anyway. So you're just going to create massive price inflation. And of course, in the process of whacking up these tariffs on Chinese exports to the US, what's China going to do? They're going to go, okay, 200% on everything from the US, and then the US will never export anything to China ever again. And we go full circle back to the fact the US then will walk away and go, we can't do this. And it proves with countries like China that having these tariff wars is absolutely pointless. And all it's going to do is make the rest of the world decouple from the US. They're going to embrace China more. So China's trade surplus with the rest of the world will continue to increase. China's manufacturing surplus is going to increase. And this is all the while, of course, that China is moving away and rotating its economy from being the manufacturer of cheapest goods or the cheap goods, to coin a phrase, kettles, toasters, etc., and all those kind of appliances and other things, to the high tech, high end uh, aspects of the market going forward. And China, of course, is moving those kind of operations out of China. They're moving to Vietnam, and everyone thinks Vietnam's stealing all China's business. And of course, that's absolutely not the case. And really, someone in the West needs to wake up to the reality of what's going on and realize, they should have learned from Trump 1.0 that a trade war with China failed. So why would a tariff war with China work either?
Yeah, I see two interesting things that sort of stand out to the reality of China's growing economy. Now, we're not talking there suddenly at 5, 10, 20% growth. No. But take a look at what they've been able to accomplish in regards to just basic. They're spending millions while the West, especially the US, is wasting billions. All of a sudden there was $500 billion to be invested in AI and all these models and the requirements of energy and this and that. And then China just quietly puts out DeepSeek that cost $6 million. Where did that come from? It blew the entire industry away, and nobody was prepared for it. You take these media influencers, whether on TikTok, YouTube, or the like, and they've been fed the propaganda regarding China for so long that when they actually go to Shenzhen, to Beijing and the like, and they see the modernized world and the people, just treating it not as if it's we're in 2100, the year 2100, but it's today and it's part of their society, it's part of their culture. And then they go back and they see the United States. They're making references to the United States compared to China. The US is a third world country. I mean, not to go too far off a tangent, the president is now having to call the National Guard and federalized troops for the capital because of crime and because of how everything has deteriorated. The bottom line is that the world, the 21st century is a Chinese century, and it's continuing to grow as we head towards 2030. The US is a dying empire, and all across the board, no matter how many trillions they spend. As a matter of fact, Thomas Massey put out today, we just crossed over the national debt, $37 trillion. That's just scratching the surface how much debt the US is in. But China continues to grow, and they're doing it for cheaper, more efficiently, and they're doing it and they're still able to produce the goods and exports to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the coping mechanisms you see in the world when all this data comes out is, oh, well, China's experiencing deflation. Like deflation's a bad thing. It's a bad thing when your economy's based on financialization, when your economy's based on selling real things, tangible goods. It's not an issue. And they talk about weak consumption inside China. And they try to attribute this all to the fact that because everyone's losing their jobs and the Chinese economy is cratering. Well, if that were indeed true, then there's a slight problem with that because people don't seem to understand that it's part of the Chinese culture that they're massive savers in terms of Chinese people across the board. So if you look in 2023, household deposits increased by 15 trillion yuan. In 2024, by 18 trillion, that's equivalent to 11.6% and 13.3% of GDP, respectively. And in the first half of 2025, they added another 10 trillion yuan. So people are saving because Chinese people just don't go out and spend money like people do in the West for the sake of spending money, because that's not what drives them as people. The other things, of course, with regards to this whole data that's coming out, US trade with China actually fell over 20% in July. Is August going to be any better? Probably not. So all this reduced trade is going to obviously have an impact on GDP because all those importers who previously bought cheap Chinese widgets and then resold them on at a profit are not going to be able to do so because China's going to start finding other markets, which is exactly what they're doing. Hence, this huge export increase to countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa, or even Europe for that matter. So they're building all these new trade relations. So they simply found more customers in the rest of the world, except obviously the United States. So China's trade surplus is 1.2 trillion. The US trade deficit is 1.2 trillion. It's a bit of a coincidence, but this is the reality of what we're living in. So all these ideas, China's got overcapacity, so they're dumping because no one will buy the stuff in China. They're dumping it on the rest of the world. What? So the rest of the world, out of the goodness of their heart, is buying up all these Chinese products. What? Are they China forcing them at gunpoint or something? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. But because the West doesn't operate with a real economy, and the United States, Europe, etc., the UK works on the basis of financialization, people have lost an understanding that China can manufacture huge amounts of goods, even though it's moving away from manufacturing cheap goods and embracing more advanced markets, including electric vehicles, solar, etc., etc. It's actually able to produce these goods and export them, and countries across the world are buying it. And also, there's this big fear in the West, well, you don't consume enough because 70% of our GDP in developed countries is consumption, but in China it's only 45%, so it's the end of the world. Why is it the end of the world? It's not. Okay, Beijing would like Chinese people to consume more. That's not a secret, but it's not as big a problem as people in the West who don't understand China whatsoever would like to make out. So if China's exports are pivoting away from the United States and entering other territories, then this is going to have an enormous knock-on effect because they're not going to return to the United States. So what happens when the United States no longer has access to those markets? And where's it going to get those imports from? Because they can't. It's not that simple. It's not like all these other countries are producing these goods. Yes, some of them are, and that some of them are taking some of the markets China's had for 20 years and running with them as well. But this is something that the United States is failing to understand. No, and therefore, if the US isn't buying China's goods, or China's not exporting to them, then when inventories become exhausted, where's the US going to buy these essential goods from? And the irony is they're slapping tariffs on everyone all over the world. So they're going to pay more for those goods no matter who they get them from. But they're going to pay even more because there's going to be a gigantic shortfall. So if the US has no access to those markets or limited access, then they're going to pay even more on top of the tariffs because the world's going to sit there and go, well, sorry, we've found other markets now. And we're working in the global south, the multipolar world. The US is in big trouble. China makes stuff. The United States prints money. And it's even got to the point, it would seem, it can no longer print money. It's going to have to beg, borrow, steal, and threaten and coerce its allies into giving them money and saying, you have to invest money in our country and rebuild our economy. Except here's the problem. Europe's bankrupt as well. So where's Europe going to get the money from? And hence why all these statements from Trump. Europe's investing 600 billion and they've had to walk away from that and go, it's not true. And by the way, nothing's been agreed anyway. And we don't have 600 billion. We don't even have 60 billion. We don't even have 6 billion because we're broke as well. So what's going to end up happening eventually? The United States will beg the Chinese to rebuild America, and China might just tell the Americans, sorry, it's not happening.
Agreed. Very much agreed. Paul, was there any other add-ons you wanted to give us before we go ahead and finish this?
No, I think that pretty, I mean, yeah, you could talk about huge amounts of other data, but I think the trade surplus, the manufacturing surplus, the export, excluding the US. And ironically, talking about deflation, core CPI in China actually rose 0.8% in July. That's not deflationary. And GDP grew 5.3% in the first half of 2025. And people go, oh, that's a lie too. Well, go and examine all the export and import data from all the countries that China trades with. And you can see that all the data adds up, and China's not faking GDP in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think in the long run, anyone in the West making declarations about manipulated data when it comes to China had better look in their backyard because last I heard, the U.S. president just fired the head of the BLS because of quote unquote manipulated data. Anyway, Paul, I think I want to thank you as always for your insight regarding this topic.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Support community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.